I call the member for Melbourne.
Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill is about Australia's first nuclear waste dump. This nuclear dump is dangerous and unnecessary. This nuclear dump is in the wrong place. This nuclear dump is opposed by the traditional owners. And this dump is being rammed through the parliament against the wishes of Territorians. Mr Deputy Speaker, I spoke at length this morning about the process chosen by the House Standing Committee on Climate Change, Environment and the Arts for conducting its inquiry into this bill. The cynically short, non-consultative and closed process by which it ultimately recommended the bill be passed with no further delay was far from a useful use of House resources. It was a waste of time. The end result of the committee process is that members at this point have no more information before them with which to make a judgment on whether or not to give this bill a second reading than when they did when the bill was referred to the committee in October. However, the inquiry whitewash is nothing compared to the heavy-handed means adopted in facilitating the passage of this bill. Let me remind members what the Labor Party said about the Howard waste dump legislation when it first tried to dump nuclear waste in the Northern Territory. A joint release from the member for Kingsford Smith, member for Lingari, Senator Carr and Senator Crossan stated that they were, quote, profoundly disappointed by the legislation. They said that the next chapter had opened in the Howard government's nuclear waste dump fiasco, with the government accepting a highly controversial site nomination at the Northern Territory's Muckaty station before scientific testing of the area. Labor called on consultation with the locals, rather than bullying by the government, and stated clearly that the traditional owners had been stripped of their rights and that they pledged to repeal the Howard laws. Well, now in government, Labor, under the tutelage of the Minister for Energy and Resources, has adopted the approach of the Howard government, as we have just heard so eloquently expressed by the member for Groom. The Labor-era waste dump legislation, like the Howard legislation, overrides state and territory laws, suspends the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act, excludes the Native Title Act and suspends the Judicial Review Act. The Labor legislation, like the Howard legislation, gives extraordinary discretionary power to the minister and allows him to operate with an absolute minimum of transparency. The Labor legislation, like the Howard legislation, ignores any commitment to procedural fairness and all avenues for judicial review. The Labor legislation, like the Howard legislation, ignores best science available in order to fast-track the supposedly volunteered dump location. And the Minister Martin Ferguson's legislation, like the Howard legislation, completely fails to uphold international best practice, particularly in relation to securing community acceptance of the waste facilities. Article 29, Part 2 of the United Nations Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People states that nations, quote, shall take effective means to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials shall take place in the lands or territories of Indigenous people without their free, prior and informed consent. And yet here is the Minister, mimicking the Howard government's best efforts to dump nuclear waste facilities on a community of people that do not want it. The last two governments didn't listen to us. You must be different, the locals wrote to every member of this House late last year. They said, we've been fighting for the last 5 years to say we don't want the waste dump in this land. Come and sit with us and hear the stories from the land. And all the while, the Minister is arguing that his consultations are complete. And that is because he inherited the deal done between a select few individuals living in the area and the former government, enabling him to claim that his obligations are finished. As a result, Mr Deputy Speaker, the traditional owners are taking action in the federal court. The first hearings of this process are on Friday, which might explain the government's desire to push this legislation through Parliament so quickly. Mr Deputy Speaker, how did we get to this appalling situation? How do we get from a situation where Labor in opposition can claim the local community was effectively bribed into accepting the waste dump on their land, to the Minister in the Labor government claiming the bill is ready to pass? while the traditional owners write heartfelt letters to all members of this place to have the minister come and meet with them? How is it that a Labor government is pointing to a few individuals with whom a deal is struck and using that to claim that the local communities have together been consulted and are content with this proposal? This Parliament should be in no doubt as to the regard in which the minister holds its members. The Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee Majority Report of 7th of May 2010 had as its first recommendation that the minister undertake consultation with all parties with an interest in or who would be affected by a decision to select the Muckaty Station site as the location for the National Radioactive Waste Facility. And as recently as December, Senator Sherry, replying to a question on notice asked by my colleague Senator Scott Ludlam in October Senate estimates, reiterated what we already knew, and I quote, "The minister has not met the Indigenous landowners who opposed the nomination." Mr Deputy Speaker, I struggle to find a more brazen example of the disregard that a minister has for parliamentary process, consultative public policy and basic human rights. Labor, led by Minister Martin Ferguson, is putting a nuclear waste dump on the land of Territorians and Indigenous Australians who don't want it. And if we have any doubt what this is really about, this bill is really about, Mr Deputy Speaker, we need only listen to the person who drafted it, the member for Groom, who spoke before and made the point very, very clearly that this is the first step in a debate about Australia having a nuclear-powered future. Given the disregard that this government, through its spokesperson in the Minister for Energy and Resources, has had for the Parliament, evident in its stubbornly proceeding with this bill while simultaneously ignoring the recommendation of the Senate Inquiry Majority Report, I move, in the terms that I think may have been circulated, that the House declines to give this bill a second reading until the Minister for Resources and Energy acts on Recommendation 1 of the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee Majority Report of 7 May 2010, namely that the Minister undertake consultations with all parties with an interest in or who would be affected by a decision to select the Muckaty Station site as the location for the National Radioactive Waste Facility. And I would ask all members whether or not they support nuclear power, whether or not they support nuclear waste being dumped in Central Australia, to ask themselves how they can oppose an amendment that simply asks the minister to meet with the people in whose backyard this waste dump is going to be. I commend the amendment to the House.